Okay, let's jump in. Okay, Louis, I want to start by asking about the titles of the pieces in the show. It's a little bit of a broad question, but can you talk about the 4 titles that are in the show?
Yes. So I romanticize these titles a lot, like in my head, as I'm making the painting or as I'm thinking of what I want to paint. And some of them are lengthy, and it's because I really, really love the way that the short stories of Gabriel Garcia Marquez are often like long and very descriptive. Mm-hmm. And I'm really inspired by his literature. So then when I go into naming them, I want them to hold such like provocative title, but also with so much to like unpack still. Mm-hmm. So then then there's 4, right? So then the one where the figure is slaughtering a goat, it's por mi culpa, por mi gran culpa, which is a line in the creed. And I grew up very Catholic, but my family's sort of relapsed now, but it's still ingrained in us. And in that painting, I was trying to convey this sort of sense of survivor's guilt, and also owning up to that guilt, and to a certain extent, enabling that loss or the slaughtering of the animal. Mm-hmm. Sort of, my paintings are all very narrative and they're allegorical, and often very personal. So then when I do so, they have a specific meaning to me, and then I try to make these paintings universal or have some sort of universal relevance, and not necessarily knowing the sort of personal story of it. And then, yeah.
Oh, can you say a little bit more about the interaction between having that universal relation, or wanting people to be able to universally relate to the painting, and the personal narratives that you are working with a little bit in them?
Yeah, so then I think for mi culpa, por mi gran culpa, por mi culpa, por mi culpa, por mi gran culpa, I was taking this scene, which is sort of borrowed from a early Renaissance painting of a Madonna, where there's like a drapery in the back, and and sort of ethereal. And those paintings, everything in that painting had a very symbolic meaning, right? So I sort of start with that, going with grapes and apples with biblical connotations, but then with grapes leading to wine and alcohol, sort of, and then these animals surrounding this sort of scene, thinking of like the nativity scene. So sort of creating this sort of religious reference, or having these like spectators also be religious figures to some sort of extent. You can't see all too much, but like I try to have some sort of emotion in some of these animals. Like if you look at the pig really up close, it's a very thin layer, but like there's tears coming down from his eyes. So anthropomorphizing them, because the lack of actual human figures, just one, sort of they act as that. Mm-hmm. So sort of trying to create these emotional, emotions out of these animals, so that like you can sort of sense what's going on, that it's sort of a bad thing, and therefore it no longer becomes such a personal narrative. It becomes something that other people can understand.
Yeah. You also mentioned a few minutes ago relating to Gabriel Garcia Marquez as sort of an overarching thread of the works in the show. Can you say more about that?
I think I'm really attracted to his short stories, and specifically the setting of Macondo, because I think a lot about where my mom is from. She's from a very small town in Guatemala called Tecolutan. And like the stories she just tells me, or like the stories I hear from my cousins when I go back, or my family when I get to visit, they seem so detached from the reality that I know here in the States, right? Mm-hmm. So I think from that, there's sort of this connection to Macondo as the setting and as a place where all this sort of magic occurs. Mm-hmm. is my interest, like my main interest in sort of speaking about magical realism, even though magical realism has its sort of problems.
Problems?
Yeah, because it's something that it's Eurocentric. The name is magical realism, then applied to genres across cultures, right? So then inherently it's sort of inherently it's not, it's limiting, right?
Yeah.
To consider his work to be magic realism when it's been coined by people not from his culture.
Yeah. In the same vein, you were also talking about, in part, being inspired by Renaissance paintings in these works. And I imagine you could say something very similar about engaging with that history. So I guess the question there is, like, how do you both relate to that, like the problems of magical realism and the problems of sort of this Eurocentric focus on Renaissance paintings when you're making?
So like, I think that's where I have like maybe a battle, right? Because I do love like painting, and people and my friends and like artist friends that I know like they know that I just like love oil paint, right? And I think because I love oil paint so much, I love the history of oil paint, right? And I go back to early Renaissance, well, technically later Renaissance, when Northern Renaissance started like adopting oil paint, right? So I think there's almost like a fetishization with that. But then also I do really, really enjoy how everything on the canvas had a meaning, right? Everything was made with intention. And I try to apply that same, like, I try to do that with my own paintings. And I sort of treat them as very precious. That's like my own, just sort of like my own sort of way I work and the way I am able to work and relate to my paintings.
Yeah, let's pivot to talking about your process and the way you work. So as a sort of way into that, I have like seen these paintings in person actually, which seeing her in person feels so distant now, but I remember seeing them when you were working on them in the studio a few months ago, and they are pretty large in scale. So I guess the question there is, how do you relate to the scale of your own work, both conceptually and process-wise, given that I assume it takes longer than it would for you're living with it longer than you would a small piece.
Yeah, so I think first it's time, right? How much time do I have allotted to making this piece, right? At Wassaic, I was there for 2 months, so I knew that I can make something big or bigger than I usually do with the same amount of detail that I would want to put in, right? But often it comes down to like the weight of the narrative, right? And how confident I am in that narrative. Yeah. And then in smaller works, they're often like these, like, all the way down to like just paper paintings, right? Like paintings, like I'll do these sort of smaller paintings that are just on paper, and they're quick and they take a few hours or less. And these are sort of like images that I want to see in the world or I want to realize, but I know that their narrative or the significance is not fully like resolved in my own head, right? So that's why like I'm enjoying quarantine so much, because enjoying quarantine to the extent to which I can enjoy it because the small paintings allow me to sort of explore things that I may feel like not ready to put on a sort of a larger narrative or a deeper narrative. So like I can put things that I've always thought as like I've always wanted to put clocks somewhere, and I just never knew really how or why, but I can do it now. So it depends on how experimental that narrative is to me, and how confident I am about it.
You just said not ready there. Do you feel like the small pieces are sort of like necessarily preparations for the larger work? Like, do you put the small work on like a lesser footing than the large work and sort of just all in preparation for that? Or how do you think of the interaction between the two?
I like to think that like I'm creating some sort of visual vocabulary, right? And a lot of my paintings have specific items that reoccur. So then I think of the small paintings as being like almost like a short story or like a novella to a larger painting, right? So when you see a lot of them in one place, you can get a sense of, or you can get a sense of the world that I'm trying to build, or like that world becomes more like palpable.
Yeah. I also want to sort of take what you were just talking about your process, take one of the pieces in the show as a case study of that. So I have up on my screen, I'm going to share it here, an Instagram post that you posted while you were in residence a few
Was
months
it a work in
ago.
progress? The
It
work in
was
progress?
a work in progress shot of one of the pieces that is now in the show. So I think it'll be interesting, if you're down, to talk about like how the piece developed from this point.
I think when I post these kind of images, I realize that I'm really like outing myself as kind of a hack sometimes, because if you know about painting, and I know that people on here who know about painting, now Johnny's here watching, so Johnny knows about painting, and he knows, and I know, and he's told me before that painting, you're not supposed to like fill in, right? And I was not necessarily not taught how to paint, but I wasn't told how to paint. I wasn't taught how to paint, oil paint, right? With oil paint. It was sort of like something I picked up because I wanted to. The school, the college I was going at didn't have the proper ventilation for oil paint. So then I sort of just went with it on my own in my apartment. So then I paint in a way that is like filling in a coloring book, right? I go object by object, piece by piece. And I've been getting better at like doing some sort of underpainting. But mostly the underpaintings are for that, like, are so that I can sort of gauge the color story. Sometimes I realized, like in my earlier work, I like the colors were really, really almost acidic and like toxic. And I used to defend it a lot by saying, and I was told by a critic, because it was a group critique, and we were looking at these paintings, and someone asked like about my color choices, and I really I was like, I have no answer. Like, this is like what I imagine, like this is how I think I see the world, right? And then someone else who's also from Miami spoke up and was like, well, like, I think these colors are representative of where he's from. Like, they feel very Miami. And like, and you only really understand that if you grew up there. And I think that has a lot to do with it. I think also my heritage, being Guatemalan American, has to do a lot with it too. Things are often colorful and vibrant.
Yeah, I remember when we talked a few months ago, you specifically talked about wanting to construct a world where it's somewhere between Miami and Guatemala. Does that still hold true, or how do you relate to that?
Definitely. And now coming back to Miami, I was in New York since college, and I just moved back because of the pandemic.
Yes, we were actually going to go hang out in a museum together in New York, and then
we were, and then everything closed down. Yeah. So I think that stems from growing up in Miami and identifying as the country your parents are from, whether or not you were born there or not. And it wasn't until I moved away from Miami that I stopped identifying myself as just Guatemalan, because in Miami, I would just say I'm Guatemalan, right? But not having lived there much and being born here, right? So then realizing how like there's an issue with that, because I've been living here, I've been exposed to opportunities and resources of the state. So then now, qualifying that as Guatemalan American makes the world building all that more stronger, because I'm trying to find a place where I feel comfortable being both and being in both places, because I really do strongly identify as a Miamian. I love Miami, as wild as it is. It's a kind of it shaped like a lot of me. It allowed me to feel so comfortable as being a Latino in the U.S. Never feeling that was ever a sort of an obstacle, because in Miami, I grew up in a community that's like 99% Latino. So then leaving Miami, right, and realizing that I was in a bubble. So I was not in Guatemala, right, even though I felt I was Guatemalan. So then building that world becomes all that more important to me.
Yeah, can you say a little bit more about what it has been like to now return to Miami in the past few months? Because you mentioned that you'd been living in New York for a while, and then now have been obviously back in Miami for the past 3 months.
Miami is, it's been, I can't complain really. I have this studio space here in my home that I grew up in, and it's unfair to say I'm underwhelmed because of when I'm in a pandemic, but it's not the same. I don't get the same sort of like like excitement as I do when I'm in New York painting.
Mm-hmm.
The energy that I feel like in New York or in a place where I know more artists, I think has a lot to do with how I make work. There's like, you know, I'm naturally a really competitive person. So then like, and you can't really be competitive with art. So then like the way that I sort of have to like the way I sort of, my competitiveness comes out is like by putting in as much more out, like I feeling like I have to be at the studio from like 7 a.m. to like 2 a.m. You know what I mean? And like measuring the time that I'm there versus where like, and then like against anyone that I'm around, right? And it's not like I'm just trying, it's not like a competitiveness that's like, it's just more for me, really. It's just more like, it gets me going, right? So then here, there's like no, I feel like there's like, I have no accountability, right? And that like, I can just go back into my room and like lay in my bed and not paint. And I have like that, and that's, I mean, it's horrible as that sounds, but like, I lost my job because of COVID. So then I had this time to paint, and it's a great opportunity. So I'm grateful for that.
I also, this is a little bit of a shift, but I also want to talk about your approach to perspective in your painting. So there's something common between the 4 pieces that are in the show, or something that is in common between the 4 pieces in the show, is that they all take this like relatively straight on point of view in them. Can you say more about why that is the like perspective that your paintings have generally taken, or at least recently?
I think I think it goes to my interest in early Renaissance work or Renaissance work in general, but then also, and this is also rooted in the Renaissance, where like I'm interested in image iconography, and in doing so, try referencing it in my paintings. So like in Ofrenda, if you could pull that one up.
Yep. Give me just a second here.
I was trying to convey this sort of ceremonial religious scene, right? And like with the middle figure or the central figure sort of being a Virgin Mary. And then so then there's a lot of yellow with surrounding it, and that was to attempt like to create sort of a halo through objects. And I thought doing so and that sort of like made me go with that sort of composition. And then with work that I'm doing now, and it's something I've always really thought about, like why I do that. So then I've tried, I'll have to lift you guys up to show you.
Yeah, show us our new studio a little bit.
Yeah, so then it's kind of large, but I'll figure this out. Let me see what I can do. So like this is a work in progress, and it's large. It's like it's kind of like the work I was working in at Wassaic. So it's like, so I was trying to break up that sort of composition that I've been leaning towards like since for a long time now, by like having a table in front of it, so that you have to travel to get to the subject of the painting. But then even then it's still sort of referencing religious iconography. I have me, my mom, and my sister sort of in this sort of almost like a holy Trinity kind of pose, sort of with the weight of the number 3 in Catholicism being a reference there. And then I have this painting, I'll have to see you guys that one. This painting of my sister that, so then I have like a field of flowers that are sort of before, like at the foreground before getting to the figure. So it's like things I think about a lot, and things that maybe that I was falling into because I was maybe really excited and start the painting, and things kind of just have happened that way. But I think ultimately it was to create this sort of, or to sort of convey a sense of religiosity.
Great. I have more questions, but I want to be mindful of where we are time-wise, and open it up for anybody in the audience who has questions now. So again, Zoom has this like hand raise function. If you have a question, raise your hand, and then I'll like pick people to come off mute one at a time. And yeah. So does anybody have any questions for Lewis? If not, I have more questions. All right, I'm gonna ask another one of my questions. So you just mentioned when we were looking at that previous painting that it was you, your mom, and your sister in the painting. And this is something we've briefly talked about while you were in residence a few months ago, that the figure you work with most often in your paintings, and specifically in two of the paintings in the show, is you. Can you say a little bit more about why you paint yourself in these paintings?
So for some of them, I will identify them as myself, and others, like which one is in the show, recogiendo mis lágrimas para mi puto bautismo, which translates to collecting my tears for my fucking baptism. That one is not necessarily like a self-portrait. It was a narrative that I wanted to realize, and I was the best model at that time, right, to convey that. But also, I think at the same time, it allows me to be very vulnerable with my audience. And regardless of whether or not it's self-portrait, or regardless of whether I treat it as such, it's still going to be read as that. So I understand that. So I don't mind it being considered a self-portrait in that case. And then with these, back working here at home, because I have my family here, which they're a big influence on my work and the narratives I try to make. So then I have them here. I can have them pose for me, and I can create work that feels more emotional and vulnerable than the work I've been making before.
Can you say a little bit more about that shift towards vulnerability in your work?
I think it's because I was working a lot. This is like after I just graduated undergrad, right? And right before I started like this sort of, I did like back-to-back residencies. And it was between that time where I was making a good amount of work, but it sort of felt distant at the end. And I hadn't really introduced the figure as I have now in my work then, mostly because I was like, I was unsure as to who I wanted to represent, right? And now when I was, I took the opportunity to be at the residency, to take that time to really question why I wanted to put figures in and who I wanted to put in. And I put myself first as to be as vulnerable as I could. And then from then on, take on subjects that felt like heavier to me, which were like my loved ones.
Yeah. Again, I have more questions, but I want to open it up to anybody in the audience who has questions. If you have a question, just use the raise hand function and I'll tell you to come on Zoom, come off of mute. Otherwise, I have more questions. Okay, I am not seeing anybody raise their hand, so I will just go on to my next question. So we also briefly talked at one point about, you mentioned offhandedly, oh no, wait, we do have a question for somebody. Sabrina, take yourself off mute.
Hey, it's so good to hear you and see all of your work. Big fan. Yeah, so I think it's really exciting to see all of the work together and like see all of the like process, because I've just been thinking about like, I wrote on my phone, but I was just like thinking about like who are like the main characters, which like was just previously talked about, of like who are the characters and the reoccurring people, and thinking about also like the objects as like these like reoccurring characters, like the different animals and the different like fruits and vegetables, and then also like the gloves like is like such a like where the more paintings I see, like the larger vocabulary I see. And so I don't know, I think the question is, like for someone, like for me, like I don't come from a historical like art background, because like I don't know like the history of like painting. And so the objects, I think the second painting of the corn being chucked, like I was like noticing that there was like cowboy boots and some other like objects that like they all feel like correct in the space. Thank you so much. Yeah. And like the present and like and yeah, and like all of these like different, and like even like the celebration horn. I guess like are there like reoccurring things that like, I'm also just like zooming in for my own self. But are there like reoccurring objects that, I guess more the objects than the animals, but the reoccurring objects that are going to be like showing up in like more work in the future, so we have a better understanding without you having to like verbally tell us, but the paintings like speak to us?
Some of them are like things that I feel like I've gotten a good grasp of painting and know that they create a good moment in the painting. Others are things that I want to create this vocabulary with. Like when I was doing gloves, this was before the pandemic, before they took on a whole different connotation. I was doing gloves, over a year now. So then I was doing so to sort of convey the sense of like distancing from the action that was occurring and the people committing the action. And then the paintings in which there's people without gloves and with gloves, the sort of that dissonance is to sort of divide the people who either are completely aware of the narrative or are not aware of the narrative. So then for like, I guess for the ones that you're seeing right now, the people who are wearing gloves to me are people who understand what's going on and understand whatever sort of unsettling or duplicitous sort of actions going on, right? And then the people without gloves are sort of have no agency in these paintings. They're sort of going along with it without really knowing what's going on. And then other sort of objects that I can talk about. I'm trying to look at here, ones that I've repeated a lot. I've trying to explore this a new reference that I have now in two paintings while I'm here, and it's robin eggs. The blue ones, the turquoise ones, and then like and those that being a symbol of like a family. And so for the one that I showed you guys earlier, I don't know if I just put it up again. There's this a robin's nest at the foreground, and then this one off to the side that's cracked, and sort of to try to convey the feeling of loss or of a family that's not completely together. And then in the one of my sister, I have two sisters. My other sister here, she's holding the bird nest, and it's going to be the robin's eggs. And I guess long story short, but I have a sister, my sister, the one being depicted in the painting of the roses, passed away when I was 14. She was 16. We were in a car accident. So she's a subject of mine that it's hard because it's emotionally difficult. Also, I had to imagine her in these sort of settings, and it's something that I don't fully feel like I am completely ready to express so bluntly. And that will be sort of the first attempt on that, because I've tried before and then I end up not finishing the painting.
Does anybody else have any other questions? Otherwise, we have Joseph. You can take yourself off mute and ask your question.
Hi. So I love how these paintings have these very sort of ambiguous narratives, especially their hands and things coming in from out of the frame. The other thing that I really notice about them too, that they're so realistic, but they're in this kind of strange 2.5D perspective. The space is so flattened, and it's really forbidden. I have this feeling of kind of wanting to enter the scene to explore and see what's going on, but it's physically impossible. Like, you know, you'd be sort of crushed as that the depth is flattened as you're going in there. I guess if you could just sort of speak about that, like how your style relates to maybe the kind of tension or ambiguity that you're trying to portray these pictures, and if there's ways that you're really playing with or pushing that.
Yeah, so I think there's two reasons for that. One of them is more technical, and it's because I mostly stick to rendering objects and figures and anything in space with local color. So then everything that's I render, like if I were to render an apple, it would mostly be just a lot of different shades of red, right? And if I wanted to render it a little bit more realistically, then I would sort of include colors that will be bouncing off from the light and objects around it. So then I purposely create that tension to create like a shallow space to sort of feel like this sort of scene is overwhelming. Like you can't quite enter it, but it's there, and it's and you can't escape it either. Like you can't go too far past it. It's sort of to confront to.
I'm going to pull up the painting so that we can read this in those.
Mm-hmm. I think the one that really is the most shallow is the Cremación Accidental, which is the smallest one. That's probably like the most shallow space where everything is sort of hitting you at once, sort of to create that overwhelming feeling of possibly being at a funeral service and it being so overwhelming that everything is sort of at once. And then the one that I probably conveyed the most space is por mi culpa, por mi culpa, por mi gran culpa. But even then, the space behind the horse is not telling you too much. It's just telling you sort of what this is. It's a pasture, or so you're allowed to move, to sort of move in the painting, but you're forced to sort of stick to what's the action at the foreground.
I mean, this one to me kind of switches. Like you can move as far back as sort of, you know, where the pig's head is, but then from there, everything just completely flattens and you're not allowed past that space.
Yeah, I could see that. Yeah, for this one, I mean, there's like the distance between the figure and the sort of drape in the back is not meant to be too far. Like you can see like the shadows of the animals are pretty close to it, and even the shadows behind it are relatively close. So then, yeah, everything's sort of pushed to the front. And I think it's also the way that I look at the sort of paintings that I look at, mostly being sort of, I really love Domenico Grandio's frescoes. So thinking about the spaces there that's constructed in those spaces are very, very flat. And everything is sort of pushed at the viewer at the same time.
Thank you. I love the tension you set up with these.
Thank you.
We have another question. I saw Jose Damien's hand first, so you can take yourself off mute and ask your question. Jose Damien, did you have a question?
Okay. No. Hello? Hello?
Hello.
Hi, this is Damien and Candy, and we love his artwork. And we just are curious about the painting that's sitting behind him with the grandmother holding the fruit. Could he talk about it? And that if he's influenced by Diego Rivera, Diego, yeah.
Of course.
Diego,
yes, Diego Rivera. Which one? The fruit?
Yes, the one right behind you. I don't know what it is.
Right there.
Yeah. Oh, this one?
Oh, I love that.
On the easel?
Right. Yes.
Oh, I think now you can see
it's
not really supposed to be a grandmother. It's supposed to be my sister again.
Oh.
But maybe you could see a little closer.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, she looks young. She looks young, yeah. Yeah, so this is like, I'm trying to like, being here back with my mom and my sister, like seeing the dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
So it's meant to be a portrait of the dynamic,
Mm.
and the sort of pressure that's one receiving from the other, and the sort of confusing communication that sort of spirals out of that. I've been using these solo cups in a few paintings,
Mm-hmm.
sort of as a way to like make communication funny, like make it ridiculous. The fact that you'll be using red solo cups sort of like a child's game to communicate, and how much communication could be lost through that sort of way of communication.
Mm-hmm.
So it's to be funny, but to sort of convey like how hard it is to communicate still. And I mean, even with loved ones and people you know your whole life. And
Mm.
yeah, so that's what that's about.
Okay. Well, it's beautiful, and I thought it was the
Thank
fruits, and it reminds me of Gauguin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, Diego Rivera, yes, love Diego
Mhm.
Rivera, love Diego
Mhm.
Rivera so much. Yeah.
Okay.
It's a big
Louis,
compliment for you to notice that, by the way, and for you to say that. Big compliment. Thank you.
Louis, you also mentioned earlier that you were excited to explore using more clocks in your work, and I noticed when you held up that painting that is one of the pieces that has a clock in it. Can you talk about your relation to that object in particular, and why that's coming up in your work in particular?
I think it's like a one-to-one, like a sense of urgency, you know, like time's ticking. And then I'm interested in what that does to the narrative of that painting, with the clock not being the focus or just being an aspect of it. So I'm interested in doing so in future paintings, like how I can convey a sense of urgency and it not having to be like a major part of it.
Yeah, great, thank you. I also noticed earlier that Susie Moya had her hand raised. I don't want to put you on the spot if your question got answered or something, but if you did have a question, feel free to take yourself off mute and ask it.
Yeah, thank you. I kind of have a two-part question. One is really about his prep work and how you get to I know that you talked about the grandeur of the scale of the paintings and how maybe committing to such a large scale piece takes committing to it takes commitment. But I was just wondering, do you mainly just start off sketches? Do you use any other materials, maybe sculpture, any other forms of media, photography that you look to in your prep?
Yeah.
And then I have another question about materials after you answer that one.
That's a good question, Susie, because about a year ago, I was really just drawing and putting in models when I could. And it was sort of, it was harder to make these paintings with a sort of even sense of light, because I was sort of putting these together in my head and then sort of trying to do it on and then sketch and then translating the sketch to the canvas. But more recently, I decided to use Photoshop. So what I usually do now is I'll sketch a scene and then try to get the figures that I want in that scene to model for me in lighting that's even, or for the lighting that's sort of for that scene. And then I Photoshop it, because like I don't have all these sort of objects available to me that I like to put in. So then I have to like Photoshop these objects in so that I can sort of see what's working. And then I'm also, and on Photoshop, I also can see the color story better, because I still am worried about how the colors will come out in the paintings, because I'm afraid that my sense of color sometimes is too out there. But I can show you what a prep image looks like. I can put up my phone and this is like me getting models and then getting objects and then collaging them. So this would be like, for the one I just showed you guys with my sister with the solo cups, this is what like it looked like as I collaged it. And then I can probably try to find the one, because the ones I also did at Wassaic, because that's when I first started doing it. And I got the help of another resident, and then Katie, who works at Wassaic, was so helpful during that time too. And it was very much a group effort. But while I pull that up, you can ask the second question.
That's awesome, thank you. And then my second question was, you talked about how you've really taken a or you're really enamored with oil paints in particular, and that being a very Eurocentric material. Have you considered, or is it something that you'd like to explore, maybe incorporating more things of a Guatemalan origin? Is that something that you're thinking towards, or that you'd like to incorporate more into your pieces, or do you feel like you're a little too far removed from that?
I'm really, really attached to oil. I don't think I could use another medium, really. I think every single time I make a painting and I get to use it, like it's surprising because it's so hard. You can't really control it, and you really have to let it do its thing, and that like sort of enamors me because it's something I won't ever really have fully control over. It's like it makes it harder, but it makes it more makes like the task of doing it all that more exciting. Hope that answered that.
Can you say a little bit more about like engaging with that loaded history of the material though? I suppose it's like sort of an extension of like what we were talking about earlier, like knowing that oil paint has this loaded history. It's like all capital A art has to be oil painted, like Renaissance style paint. Like there's, I mean, I don't think that's necessarily the opinion of the day anymore, but do you think about engaging with the history of oil painting as you work, or is that not something that's necessarily top of mind?
I don't think it's necessarily on the top of my head when I go in and create a painting. I think in the end, with all my paintings surrounding me, I think, but I'm also, like I said, I'm not using it very traditionally. I'm not doing a whole lot of underpaintings. I mean, I am doing a bit of like grisaille with like this, with people, with figures, like where like a grisaille was like back in the day where they would mix yellow ochre, like a Mars black equivalent, and white to create this sort of just a gradient, and then you would do that underpainting. And it was like Sargent did it a lot too, but then people before him did it a lot too, and it was a way that you could just sort of get the values right. But then later it became a way to like getting these gray tones in the skin to come out more. I know like Sargent, there's paintings of his where like the grisaille just sort of, just there's like a very thin coat of paint on top, and you can see most of the grisaille, like parts of the hands and things like that. So I think that like I'm interested, but not in a sense where it's important to understand my work or in the context of my work. I think it's more of a thing that I do on my own.
Great, thank you. Does anybody else have any other questions? If so, choose the raise hand function thing. Otherwise, I still have more questions for Louis. Okay, so I want to ask about something that you mentioned earlier offhandedly in one of your answers. You said that you're afraid that your sense of color is too out there. What did you mean by that?
I think when I go to mix paint, I don't mute it enough, or like I don't place it in a world that feels like it's our own. And I think for a long time I was trying to not do that, but now I'm realizing that I want to continue to do that, but in a way that's like a medium, right, where it's not offensive to the eyes, but it stands out, and it becomes sort of an identifier.
Yeah. Has your sense of color, you just gestured towards this a little bit, but can you say a little bit more broadly, like how your sense of color has changed over time, both super broadly and just in the past few months even?
Yeah. And I think it's like, when you're a little kid and your favorite color changes every week or month. Mm-hmm. I'm still very much like that. And it translates in my paintings. Like right now I've been in Miami. I've been wanting to make really warm paintings and really warm skin tones. So like those kind of things I think are sort of this happenstance and occur more naturally. And then there's certain like colors that I really do always kind of want to see in a painting, which are like really acidic greens and reds and like really vibrant reds.
Yeah, I'm seeing those even, now that you say that, I'm seeing that recurring red in every piece that's over your shoulder right now.
Yeah, right now it's really red. Yeah, it's really red over here.
Can you
Miami.
can you say a little bit more about those like small works that are over your shoulder there, or just like even show us those?
I
don't know if they're like affixed to the wall, but
this one, yeah, this is a painting on stretchers, and then this is the one I'm working on now, and then this is one I probably won't finish, that one up top, and then these paperwork, so just a few of them that I've been doing over here. The paperworks are, like I said before, like things that I want to see, and then don't necessarily mean too much to me. Mm-hmm. But I find them to definitely create a whole narrative, like help build the world, right? And then the paintings with these figures were sort of kind of like an ode to each person, and what I find about them that's curious, or what I find about them that I haven't necessarily told them. So then it's not necessarily like good or bad. It's more of a observational since I've been here, and like what I would want to convey in that painting.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Does anybody else have any questions to jump in here? Feel free. Okay, I have a follow-up question to that in particular. So you just were talking about having sometimes the figures in the work being like an ode to a person, and bringing through things that you haven't told them about what you see them. Can you say a little bit more about how that works in your practice in general? I could imagine it could be something like, yeah, I want my practice to be sort of a gift-giving thing, or like to sort of give back to people that I know, but I don't want to put words in your mouth there. How do you relate to that?
I think what you said about gift giving resonates a lot, because I have a hard time letting go of paintings, and when I do, I often just like I want to give them to someone that I that have like like same way you fall in love with someone, you fall in love with a friend, right? And I want to give them away. Like I remember when I was Wassaic, I had this little painting that I did on paper, and I had the whole time I was there, and for 2 months. And then the last day, I decided to give it to Steele, who used to work at Wassaic. It was like my going away present. It was, it was just something for her to remember me by. Like we grew close, but nothing like intense. But it was something just for her, So then I do love the idea of my paintings being a sort of gift giving, or a way to show like my love to that person, or when I'm in they're a little bit more personal. And then like the ones where it's my family, it's a little bit a more complicated narrative, because I'm thinking a lot about trauma and the way that trauma could be sort of translated between person, and how it's sort of I'm attempting to make this sort of circular motion of trauma.
Can you pause on that painting in particular a little bit more? Just like give us sort of a few seconds to sit on it. And if anybody has any questions that come up, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, so that's that painting.
Great.
You can see pretty well from there, right?
Yeah. Does anybody else have questions? Okay, I just have like a couple more questions, and if anybody else has questions, we'll finish up after that. But you mentioned earlier that one of the pieces up above your right shoulder right now, you're not going to finish. How do you know when you are versus are not going to finish painting?
I have this habit that formed every single time I go to a new place to paint, that the first thing I usually do, I don't finish. And I think now it's become more of a joke that I have like with myself, that like I never finish the first thing I start. But it really has been true. Like every single residency I've gone to, every single new studio space that I've been to, whatever I start first, I don't end up finishing it. And I think it's because I'm excited to work, right? I'm excited to have that space. It's brand new space. So I jump on the idea that feels that I can complete maybe the fastest, or that feels like the most exciting at that moment. And then often they don't translate to something I can really connect with. So it's usually, I decide usually when I feel like I've lost any sort of emotional connection to that painting.
Yeah, can you say a little bit more how you relate to like the speed of painting? Because I remember even a few months ago, you briefly mentioned something about like being sort of impatient for the pieces to be done. Does that still hold true a few months later, or?
I am impatient, but I'm also slow. So it's almost like self-sabotaging, because I know that it'll take so long to finish. I know that I'll take a long time, but I think, you know, the issue is that I'm not impatient. It's not necessarily that I want them done. It's that I want to see more of them. So then like this, I feel pretty content because there's a lot of things going on and they're not all quite done, but there's a lot that I start seeing, like this sort of world, like being built in a place that I hadn't had any other artwork.
Yeah, when you say you want more of them done, do you mean like more of the individual piece done, or are you like, while you're working on a given painting, like, oh, I know the companion for this piece that's next, and I want to finish this one so that I can like fill in that one and put that alongside this and start building that narrative.
So because they're kind of quite slow painting and it's very like up close, I have a lot of time to just like, you know, think about whatever. So then often I'm thinking about the next painting. And then that's when I start getting impatient, because I know when I'm in the middle of one that it's going to take a bit to get to the other one. And if I start so many, then I'll never finish one, right? So it's like kind of like find a happy medium where I have enough that I'm happy about and enough that I don't feel like I need to make more, and hopefully not have an idea, because I fear having too many ideas when I'm painting stuff, because I know that I won't realize them. Yeah.
That's, I think, a good problem to have in some sense, though.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any other questions before we end things up? Speak now, or guess not forever, hold your peace. You can always email Lewis or message him on Instagram if you have one later. Okay, if nobody else has any questions, we'll wrap things up. Thank you, everybody, for attending the talk. Thank you, Lewis, for taking the time to talk. It was really great to talk to you again.
And it was long. Thank you so much for allowing me to talk for so long.
Yeah, let's go for a little while. Again, if you want to revisit Lewis's work, it's available on the first floor of our summer exhibition, which is available at wasaicproject.org. It's also available in a limited edition book that we're publishing. Yeah, I think that's it, everybody. Thank you all for attending.